Imagine a world where a single moment, just one act of kindness, has the power to change everything. What if a simple hug could break down years of walls built by fear and doubt? Meet Sophie, a young girl who hadn't been able to trust anyone, not even her own father. But all that began to change when a stranger with nothing to offer but patience and warmth stepped into her life. This is a story about healing, about finding the courage to be vulnerable, and about the unspoken power of love. Stay with us, because by the end of this journey, your perspective on what truly matters might never be the same. It was a crisp autumn morning in Mill Creek, Oregon, a small town where everyone knew everyone. The Cozy Corner Cafe, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop on Main Street, was the heartbeat of the community. The air was rich with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, sizzling bacon, and the sweet scent of cinnamon rolls. This wasn't the kind of place for the high-flying elite, it was for locals, a warm haven where old friends caught up and strangers quickly became familiar faces. On this particular morning, a man who didn't quite belong stepped into the cafe. Harrison Ford, a 62-year-old billionaire tech mogul, walked in, his presence immediately drawing the attention of the regulars. He was a man of control, precision, and power, traits that had made him one of Silicon Valley's most successful entrepreneurs. Yet, he was out of place here, dressed in an expensive tailored suit, his face tight with the weight of the world. At a table near the window, sat his daughter, Sophie, a 7-year-old girl with soft brown curls and big, doe-like eyes. She was distant, her small hands fidgeting in her lap, her posture curled inward. Sophie wasn't like other children. She struggled with social anxiety and avoided any form of physical touch. The silence between them spoke volumes. Harrison had never once been able to hold her, not in the way a father should. The morning rush had subsided, and the cafe was beginning to slow down. The sun had fully risen, casting a soft golden hue through the windows, making the small diner feel even more inviting. The chatter of the remaining patrons was a low hum, interrupted only by the clink of coffee mugs and the occasional laughter from a table of elderly couples reminiscing about old times. It was the kind of peaceful atmosphere where even the smallest actions could seem amplified. Charlotte Miller, a waitress in her early 30s, weaved through the tables with practiced ease, refilling cups and delivering plates of pancakes and eggs. Despite her busy shift, there was something remarkably serene about her. She had spent years as a pediatric nurse before her life had taken an unexpected turn, leading her to work at the Cozy Corner Cafe. But her nurturing instincts were still as sharp as ever, especially when it came to children, particularly the quiet ones. She couldn't help but notice Sophie, sitting motionless at the table, her small body hunched and eyes cast downward. Every now and then, Sophie's fingers would twitch, and her gaze would flicker briefly toward her father, only to retreat back to the safety of her lap. Charlotte had seen this before, children like Sophie, who didn't quite know how to navigate the world around them, who found solace in silence and isolation. It was when the clatter of a dropped dish broke the stillness of the room that things changed. The sound, loud and sharp, seemed to jolt Sophie out of her trance. Her body stiffened, and her hands flew to her ears as her breath grew shallow. Her small chest rose and fell rapidly, her eyes darting around in a panic. The peaceful atmosphere that had once filled the cafe was suddenly drowned out by the frantic energy emanating from the young girl. Sophie's world had become too loud, too bright, too much for her to handle. Her body was trembling, her mind racing with confusion and fear. Harrison froze, his hand halfway to his coffee cup, unsure of what to do. His usual confidence, honed from years of business meetings and high-stakes deals, seemed to falter in the face of his daughter's distress. He reached across the table, his voice cracking with uncertainty as he softly called her name, Sophie. "It's okay. It's just a plate." But the words felt hollow, like they couldn't bridge the gap between them. Sophie wasn't hearing him. She was lost in her own world of panic and fear. Charlotte had been watching the exchange from across the room. She didn't rush, didn't make any sudden movements. She knew that when a child was in distress, rushing in too quickly could make things worse. Instead, she walked toward Sophie with a quiet confidence, her steps measured, her movements slow and purposeful. She knelt down a few feet away from the trembling girl, positioning herself at a safe distance, not too close, but close enough to be seen. Charlotte didn't speak immediately. She simply opened her arms wide, palms up, a silent offering of comfort, a gesture that didn't demand anything but the promise of safety. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sophie's wide, frightened eyes locked onto Charlotte's face. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sophie's breath hitched as she stared at the woman, unsure of what to do. It was as though the world outside had ceased to exist, and all that mattered was this simple, silent invitation. Sophie remained frozen, but then, slowly, ever so slowly, she began to move. Her small feet shuffled toward Charlotte, her hands still pressed tightly against her ears. And when she reached her, without a word, Sophie stepped into Charlotte's open arms. The world seemed to pause. The tension in the room dissolved, replaced by a soft, collective exhale from the people who had been watching. Harrison sat frozen, his hands still suspended in the air, his mouth slightly agape. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to see before. His daughter had just done something he had never been able to make her do. Sophie had reached out, not with words, but with a need for comfort that transcended anything he had tried to offer. It wasn't just a hug, it was a moment of connection, a silent understanding that needed no explanation. Charlotte didn't say anything as she held Sophie. She simply allowed the moment to unfold, knowing that sometimes the greatest healing doesn't come from fixing things, it comes from just being there, offering kindness without expectation. It wasn't a miracle, but for Sophie, it was the beginning of something new. The next morning, the air in the cozy corner cafe felt different. There was a quiet anticipation, almost like the calm before a storm, but no one could quite put their finger on it. The usual early risers had already come and gone, leaving behind empty mugs and untouched plates of half-eaten toast. As Charlotte wiped down the counter, she caught sight of Harrison Ford walking through the door, looking much like he had the day before, crisp shirt, neatly pressed, but this time there was something softer in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. His shoulders were no longer as stiff, and his stride, though still purposeful, seemed less guarded. He walked up to the counter and stood there for a moment, not demanding attention, but certainly commanding it. He didn't have the entourage he usually did, no assistants or bodyguards flanking him, just a man standing in the quiet hum of a small cafe. Charlotte looked up, meeting his gaze, and offered a polite smile. "Good morning," she said, pausing to pour him a fresh cup of coffee. "What can I get for you today?" Harrison hesitated, as if weighing his words, before finally speaking. "I wanted to thank you," he said, his voice rougher than it had been the day before. "For what you did yesterday. With Sophie." Charlotte's brow furrowed slightly, unsure where this conversation was going. She hadn't expected him to return, let alone offer a thank you. She simply nodded, not because she wanted praise, but because she understood the gravity of what he was saying. "She's a sweet girl," Charlotte said gently, her eyes soft with understanding. It was nothing. But Harrison didn't let it go. He cleared his throat, his posture shifting slightly as if he were about to ask something more. "She's not like other kids," he began, the words hesitant, as though they were difficult to say. She screams when doctors try to listen to her heartbeat. She won't even sit beside her therapists. But yesterday, she walked across the room, and she hugged you. And for a moment, I saw her do something that I never thought I'd see her do. It felt different." Charlotte remained silent, watching him closely. She had learned long ago that children like Sophie couldn't be forced to make progress, they needed time, patience, and most of all, understanding. She knew the significance of that hug, even if Harrison didn't fully grasp it yet. Harrison shifted his weight and pulled a small business card from his pocket. He slid it across the counter toward her, his fingers brushing against the edge of her hand. "I don't know what you do outside of here," he said slowly, "but I'd like to offer you something. Not a job, not exactly. I just thought maybe you could spend more time with Sophie. Talk to her, or just sit with her, whatever feels right." He paused, looking at her intently. I'll pay you well, of course. Charlotte glanced down at the card but didn't immediately take it. The offer was tempting, yet something about it didn't sit right. She had spent years working in a high-stress environment, doing her best to help children in need, but this was different. Sophie wasn't just another child to fix. I'll think about it, Charlotte said after a long pause, finally taking the card and placing it beside the napkin dispenser. She didn't look up immediately, sensing that Harrison still had more to say. There was a brief silence between them, one that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Finally, Harrison stood, his face unreadable. But just as he was about to leave, he hesitated and reached into his jacket pocket once more. "One more thing," he said, his voice softer this time. "I found this on the back seat of my car. I think it's for you." He handed her a small, crumpled piece of paper, carefully folded and slightly creased at the edges. Charlotte took it, unfolding it carefully. Inside, in bold crayon strokes, was a simple drawing, 2 stick figures, arms outstretched toward each other, a shaky red heart drawn in between. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Charlotte stared at the drawing for a long moment, feeling a tightness in her chest. She hadn't expected this. A child's drawing, a silent invitation for connection. It was raw and vulnerable in a way that words could never be. She looked up at Harrison, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell her I'd love to come by," she said softly. "Just for a little while." Harrison nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice quieter now, almost as if the weight of the moment was sinking in. As he left the cafe, Charlotte folded the drawing carefully and tucked it away in her pocket. She wasn't sure what this meant for her, for Sophie, or for Harrison, but she knew one thing for certain: something had shifted. And that shift, however small, felt important. In the days that followed, Charlotte couldn't shake the image of the crumpled drawing Sophie had made. It wasn't just a picture, it was an invitation, a message from a child who had spent so long closed off from the world. The simplicity of the drawing, a heart between 2 figures, spoke volumes. Charlotte knew it meant more than just a gesture of kindness, it was a bridge between Sophie and the world she had been afraid of. Harrison, too, seemed changed. The man who had walked into the cafe the previous week, distant and cold, now returned with a quieter presence. He didn't make demands or speak with the same authoritative tone. Instead, there was a sense of vulnerability in his eyes, a weariness that hadn't been there before. He had made arrangements for Charlotte to visit Sophie, and over the course of the next several weeks, they began to form a rhythm. Charlotte never pushed Sophie, never tried to force her into situations she wasn't ready for. Instead, she brought books, toys, and her calming presence, offering a safe space for Sophie to explore, to draw, to listen to stories. At first, Sophie barely spoke. She would sit quietly, sometimes curling up with a stuffed bear or playing with the crayons Charlotte brought along. Other times, she would simply sit in the corner, her small fingers wrapped tightly around her knees, her gaze lost in the world outside. But there were small moments, like when Sophie slowly began to look up at Charlotte when she spoke or when she took a hesitant step toward her to hand over a drawing. It was progress, though imperceptible to most. Charlotte didn't measure success in leaps and bounds but in the slow unfolding of trust, a trust that had once seemed impossible to cultivate. Meanwhile, Harrison began to notice changes at home. Sophie was still reserved, but she was calmer. Her anxiety attacks became less frequent, and she began to engage with the world around her in ways she hadn't before. She started to touch things more, gently stroking the pages of a book or tracing the outline of her stuffed animals. For the first time in what felt like forever, Harrison began to see his daughter relax, even if it was just a little. The walls around her were slowly coming down, brick by brick, and it was because of the quiet presence Charlotte had brought into their lives. But for Harrison, the biggest change wasn't just in Sophie. It was in himself. He found himself standing outside the room where Charlotte and Sophie spent time together, watching them interact. His eyes would linger on the way Sophie's tense shoulders seemed to soften whenever Charlotte spoke gently to her, or the way Sophie's hands, once always clenched in tight fists, now rested more naturally in her lap. It was in these moments, these small shifts, that Harrison realized just how much he had overlooked. The importance of touch, of connection, of simple human kindness. It was something he had dismissed for years, buried under the weight of his work and success. He had always believed that control was the key to success, that strength and discipline were the things that made people thrive. But now, as he watched his daughter slowly open up, he understood that sometimes, it was the softest touches, the ones that didn't demand anything in return, that made the greatest difference. Still, Harrison couldn't quite reconcile what he was seeing with the man he had always been. He felt conflicted, torn between the world he had built with his own hands and the vulnerability that was now creeping into his life. It wasn't that he didn't want to change, but the realization that he had spent so many years focused on the wrong things was unsettling. How had he missed it? How had he failed to see that Sophie needed more than just structure and discipline? She needed love, and patience, and safety, the very things he had never been able to give her. It was one evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, that Harrison found himself alone in the living room, staring at the photograph of his family from years ago. He traced the image of his younger self, the man who had once been full of ambition and drive. That man had built an empire, but in doing so, he had lost something essential, something he wasn't sure he could ever get back. And yet, for the first time in his life, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late to rebuild, not just his company, but his relationship with Sophie, and with himself. The days began to blur together, a gentle mix of soft conversations, drawings, and moments of quiet connection. Charlotte continued to visit Sophie regularly, never pushing, just being there. With each passing week, Sophie grew more comfortable, more at ease in her own skin. There were still moments of anxiety, moments when her small hands would tremble or her eyes would widen in panic, but they were fewer and farther between. And when those moments came, Charlotte was there, quiet, patient, unassuming, offering only the safety of her presence. Harrison watched from a distance, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and guilt. The changes in Sophie were undeniable, but what struck him most was the transformation in himself. He began to see the cracks in the armor he had built around his life, the emotional distance, the cold efficiency, the ever-present need for control. It was all he had known, but it had left him isolated, both from the people closest to him and from the most important parts of himself. He was beginning to realize that the love and care Sophie needed weren't things that could be dictated from the top down, like a business deal or a carefully planned negotiation. They had to come from a place of vulnerability, of trust, and, most importantly, of presence. But as much as Harrison had changed, there was still the matter of the world outside, the judgment, the expectations, the looming presence of the media. The photo of Sophie and Charlotte hugging had gone viral, plastered across local blogs, gossip sites, and even daytime talk shows. It was a candid moment, captured unknowingly by a customer sitting at a corner booth, a small act of kindness that had been turned into a spectacle. Headlines ran with accusations of inappropriate boundaries, questioning why a billionaire would trust a stranger with his child. Harrison's assistant had sent him the link to the story that morning, his concern evident in the text, "You'll want to handle this before it spirals." The image of Sophie, so vulnerable in Charlotte's arms, sent a pang through Harrison's chest. But what hurt more was seeing the way the media had twisted it, as if the love Charlotte had given Sophie was something to be questioned, something to be feared. The world saw it as a scandal, Harrison saw it as a breakthrough. Still, he couldn't shake the discomfort. His instinct was to control, to fix the narrative before it spiraled out of his grasp. But this time, he didn't react with the same immediacy as he would have in the past. Instead of rushing to suppress the story, he took a moment to reflect on the deeper implications of what had happened. By afternoon, Harrison had made up his mind. He couldn't let the noise from the outside world destroy what had been so quietly built between Charlotte, Sophie, and himself. He didn't need the media or anyone else to validate what he had witnessed, the healing, the trust, the love. But as much as he tried to ignore the stirrings of guilt and the sharp pang of public judgment, the reality was impossible to escape. Something had to change. That evening, after a long day of meetings, Harrison drove to the cozy corner cafe. He hadn't told Charlotte he was coming, and he didn't intend to. He just needed to see her, to know that the connection they had made, the progress they had made, hadn't been tainted by the chaos outside. When he walked in, Charlotte was at the counter, folding napkins with a quiet concentration. She looked up at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Harrison cleared his throat, his voice softer than he expected. "I've made a decision," he said slowly, "about the arrangement." Charlotte looked at him, waiting, her expression unreadable. She didn't ask for more information. She had seen the subtle changes in him, the growth, but she also knew he was still grappling with his own fears and expectations. "I want to make sure Sophie has what she needs," Harrison continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And I realized that what she needs most isn't money or therapy sessions. It's time. Time with someone who's patient, someone who doesn't try to fix her, but just lets her be." He paused, taking a breath before continuing, "And I think you're that person, Charlotte. You've already given her more than I ever could. I want to give you something real. Not just money, but an opportunity to help children like Sophie. Help them feel safe, feel understood. I want to help you create something bigger. A program. A non-profit." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected this. She had never asked for anything in return for her time spent with Sophie. But now, hearing Harrison speak these words, it felt like a new door had opened. The opportunity to create something lasting, something meaningful, was within her reach. Maybe we could start with something small," Harrison added, his voice softening even more. "A program for children who need what Sophie needs. A safe space." Charlotte looked at him, her gaze soft but determined. She had always believed in the power of connection, of just being there for those who needed it most. Now, it seemed like that simple belief could turn into something far greater. "I'd like that," she said quietly, her voice steady. One day, after weeks of silent progress, Sophie looked up from the floor where she had been coloring with Charlotte. For the first time, she didn't pull her arms tightly around herself. Instead, she looked up at Charlotte and, without a word, walked over to her and wrapped her small arms around Charlotte's waist. It was a quiet moment, but one that felt like everything had shifted. For the first time in her life, Sophie didn't just allow herself to be hugged, she initiated it. Harrison, who had been watching from the doorway, felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never seen his daughter like this, not only reaching out for affection, but asking for it in a way that showed true trust. His mind flashed back to the days when he had believed that his empire of deals and achievements would be enough for Sophie. How wrong he had been. It wasn't the wealth he had accumulated that had made a difference, it was the human connections that mattered the most. It was Charlotte's unwavering kindness and the unconditional love Sophie was finally learning to accept that had changed everything. As the weeks turned into months, Harrison's role in the program began to evolve. At first, he had simply been a silent investor, offering financial backing and support. But slowly, he became more involved in the day-to-day operations. He started to see the impact the program was having on families, and he began to work alongside Charlotte in developing new initiatives, reaching out to more communities, and helping to create spaces where children like Sophie could feel safe and loved. The success of The First Embrace wasn't measured by profits or media attention, it was measured by the quiet moments of transformation, a child learning to trust again, a parent finding hope, and a father finally learning how to be present in his child's life. Charlotte, too, was changing. The once solitary woman, who had come to the cafe with nothing more than a kind smile and a love for children, had become a cornerstone of the community. She was no longer just a waitress, she was a guide, a mentor, and a friend to so many. And while she had never sought recognition, she was beginning to realize that the work she was doing, the simple act of being there for others, had an impact far beyond what she had ever imagined. Through it all, Charlotte had never lost sight of what mattered most, the importance of showing up, of offering time and presence, of embracing the quiet, messy moments. She had always believed in the power of human connection, but now she saw it more clearly than ever. And as she watched Sophie, who had once been afraid to look anyone in the eye, now laughing and playing with other children, Charlotte knew that her decision to step into Sophie's world had been the right one. She wasn't just helping Sophie anymore, she was helping herself, too. One day, after weeks of silent progress, Sophie looked up from the floor where she had been coloring with Charlotte. For the first time, she didn't pull her arms tightly around herself. Instead, she looked up at Charlotte and, without a word, walked over to her and wrapped her small arms around Charlotte's waist. It was a quiet moment, but one that felt like everything had shifted. For the first time in her life, Sophie didn't just allow herself to be hugged, she initiated it. Harrison, who had been watching from the doorway, felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never seen his daughter like this, not only reaching out for affection, but asking for it in a way that showed true trust. His mind flashed back to the days when he had believed that his empire of deals and achievements would be enough for Sophie. How wrong he had been. It wasn't the wealth he had accumulated that had made a difference, it was the human connections that mattered the most. It was Charlotte's unwavering kindness and the unconditional love Sophie was finally learning to accept that had changed everything. As the weeks turned into months, Harrison's role in the program began to evolve. At first, he had simply been a silent investor, offering financial backing and support. But slowly, he became more involved in the day-to-day operations. He started to see the impact the program was having on families, and he began to work alongside Charlotte in developing new initiatives, reaching out to more communities, and helping to create spaces where children like Sophie could feel safe and loved. The success of The First Embrace wasn't measured by profits or media attention, it was measured by the quiet moments of transformation, a child learning to trust again, a parent finding hope, and a father finally learning how to be present in his child's life. Charlotte, too, was changing. The once solitary woman, who had come to the cafe with nothing more than a kind smile and a love for children, had become a cornerstone of the community. She was no longer just a waitress, she was a guide, a mentor, and a friend to so many. And while she had never sought recognition, she was beginning to realize that the work she was doing, the simple act of being there for others, had an impact far beyond what she had ever imagined. Through it all, Charlotte had never lost sight of what mattered most, the importance of showing up, of offering time and presence, of embracing the quiet, messy moments. She had always believed in the power of human connection, but now she saw it more clearly than ever. And as she watched Sophie, who had once been afraid to look anyone in the eye, now laughing and playing with other children, Charlotte knew that her decision to step into Sophie's world had been the right one. She wasn't just helping Sophie anymore, she was helping herself, too. As time went on, the program continued to grow, and so did the bond between Charlotte, Harrison, and Sophie. They had created something far bigger than any of them had expected. The First Embrace had touched the lives of so many families in ways no one could have predicted. It wasn't about the flashy events or the media attention, it was the quiet, consistent impact of showing up, of simply being there for someone when they needed it most. It was a reminder to every parent, every caregiver, and every child that healing doesn't come from perfection, it comes from understanding, patience, and love. One afternoon, as the program's first official community event was underway, Charlotte stood by the side, watching Sophie interact with the other children. The sun had begun to dip, casting a golden glow over the grassy field where families had gathered for story circles, music, and a picnic. There were no speeches, no grand announcements, just simple, peaceful moments of connection. The children laughed and played, their faces lighting up with joy, and their parents watched with quiet pride. Charlotte smiled as she watched Sophie, now fully engaged with the other children. There were no signs of the nervous, withdrawn girl she had met months ago. Sophie had blossomed into a confident, happy child, unafraid to be around others and even more unafraid to seek out love and affection. She wasn't perfect, but then again, neither was Charlotte. The beauty of what they had built together wasn't in the flawless success of their work, it was in the quiet victories, in the moments when a child finally felt safe enough to trust, to hug, and to love. As Charlotte took a step back to let the families enjoy their day, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to see Harrison standing beside her, his expression soft, his eyes warm with emotion. There was no need for words, none at all. They had both come so far, and in the midst of it all, they had found something they had both been searching for: connection, healing, and the courage to be vulnerable. "I never thought it would come to this," Harrison said quietly, his voice filled with wonder. "I spent my whole life chasing things: money, success, control. But none of it mattered like this. None of it mattered until I understood that what really counts is showing up for the people who need us. And you showed me that." Charlotte didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. She had never sought out validation or recognition. She had always simply believed in the power of kindness, of being there for others without expecting anything in return. But standing beside Harrison, watching the children play and the families smile, she felt something shift inside her. She had done more than just help a child. She had helped an entire community rediscover what it meant to care for one another, to embrace vulnerability, and to be present in each other's lives. As the event wound down, Sophie walked over to Charlotte, her small hand holding something crumpled in her palm. It was a drawing, the same simple stick figures with arms outstretched and a heart between them, this time, drawn in green and blue crayons. Sophie looked up at Charlotte, her eyes wide with a mixture of pride and shyness. Without saying a word, she handed it over, her fingers brushing against Charlotte's. Charlotte took the drawing, her heart swelling. She had seen many drawings, many signs of progress over the months, but this one felt different. It wasn't just a drawing, it was Sophie's way of saying thank you, of showing that she had come to trust, to love, and to feel safe. Charlotte crouched down, pulling Sophie into her arms for a warm, gentle hug. For the first time, Sophie didn't hesitate. She didn't pull away. She just melted into the embrace, resting her head against Charlotte's shoulder. Harrison, watching from a distance, felt a lump form in his throat. In that moment, he understood. He understood that this was what he had been searching for all along, not the validation of his success or the admiration of his peers, but the quiet, beautiful moments of human connection. The things that couldn't be measured, the things that couldn't be bought. And as he walked over to them, joining the embrace, he finally realized that the richest moments in life were the ones that money could never buy. The love, the trust, and the healing that had taken place in that small, peaceful corner of the world had given him more than he had ever imagined. As they stood together, Sophie nestled between them. Charlotte and Harrison knew one thing for certain: it wasn't just Sophie who had been healed. It was all of them. The story of Sophie, Charlotte, and Harrison was a journey that had begun with uncertainty, but one that was now defined by healing, connection, and love. And from it, there was a lesson that resonated deeply with everyone involved. Sometimes, the greatest transformations don't come from fixing what's broken, they come from embracing what is, accepting it, and allowing room for growth in a space of safety and trust. The truth in this story can be applied to all of us, regardless of our age, background, or life situation. In a world that often values success, achievement, and perfection, we sometimes forget that the most important things in life are the simplest: love, connection, and acceptance. If you believe that the power of human connection can heal even the deepest wounds, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will restore your faith in humanity. And share this video with someone who needs a little reminder that love, kindness, and presence are the things that change lives. Let's spread some positivity today.